So great to be here. And first of all, I just want to express my gratitude to this amazing organization, CCJA, that's sponsoring these. And it kind of coincided with a lot of sort of digging deeper that I've been doing myself lately with Lyle. And so I, really, jumped at the opportunity and of course, you get into it and then there's like, wow, there's some really a lot of stuff to organize here. But without further ado, I'm going to kind of move into it. And for those of you who don't know, I actually, I think just by rhythm of life, ended up with a 45-year friendship with Lyle that kind of covered like basically three periods. There was the period of being together in college at North Texas State University, which is now called the University of North Texas, UNT. And then the second period was kind of the, backstage after Pat Metheny concerts in various parts of the world. And then the third stage was really after Lyle was no longer doing the Metheny gig and had really moved into his own life out in California, and we really developed kind of a friendship that really rarely actually covered music. It was a lot of other topics. So we'll get into that in both of these sessions. And today I'm going to kind of start with sort of how I met Lyle in the first place. And once again, it was a rhythm of life thing. I had gone down to North Texas State in the fall of '73 and Christmas break, gone back up to Denver and at Grand Junction actually at the time to see my family, and drove back. And it was one of those scenes that, as many of you experienced at a college, when you come back after Christmas break and you walk in a few days before school starts and it's like a ghost town. There was like nobody on campus. It was just like dead. And there was a music dorm there. I know Andrew Duncan's on. He knows Bruce Hall. The musicians dorm is still there, actually, still happening as the musicians dorm. And at the time, a couple of friends of mine were in that dorm, and they had a thing where the basement rooms had mattresses on the walls, and they would let groups rehearse down there or drummers practice. And so I was in town. There was nobody around, but I called one of my best friends, Gene Glover, a great drummer. It's still down in Dallas, and he was around. And he said, "Well, let's meet over there in my practice room, and we'll play." So I brought my tenor over, and we played for a while. After we finished playing, we were walking out, and also in the basement was a laundry room. And we were walking through the laundry room, and we're like, "Whoa, what is this?" There was like these three Wenger booths that had been put up over break, and we had never seen them before. And we're like, "Wow, this is kind of cool." And then all of a sudden, we're hear this amazing piano coming out of this booth, and we're looking in, trying to look, and we're like, "Who is this guy?" And his hair down to his butt, and we're going like, "What? Who is this person?" We hadn't seen him on campus, we had no idea. So we just sat out there and listened because it was so amazing. And then after about 5 minutes, he stopped abruptly and just got up and walked out and introduced himself and said, "My name is Lyle Mays. I just arrived here a few hours ago, and I'm going to be going to school here this semester." So, of course, we knew nothing of him at all, and so in our naivety, we said, "Well, we have this combo, and we rehearse in one of these rooms here. I think everybody's going to be back tomorrow. Would you like to play with us?" And he says, "Of course." So the next day, he pulls up in this truck camper. Actually, I got a great little photo. This is kind of like, this is as close as I could say. This was something like this. Probably not quite as new as this one, but it was basically this kind of deal. And actually, this is the only picture I have from that is from that period of time. He also had a barbershop quartet that he put together with Pat Coyle, who's on the left. Lyle's in the red there. And so anyway, he pulls up in this truck camper, and we help I helped him move his Fender Rhodes top and bottom down into our little practice room. And for the next 2 nights, I believe, two or three, I can't remember. I know it was at least two. We had jam sessions with Lyle Mays, and so that was my first way to get connected. And from there, he obviously was meeting other musicians on campus that really were in his league to be playing with. And but I did, continue to encounter him. He would pop into improv classes. Actually, the improv class teacher at the time was really the great jazz euphonium player, Rich Madison. And Rich was actually the one who had met Lyle at one of the jazz camps and had talked him into coming down there. So Lyle would sometimes sub or pop into the to those classes. So that's when I got to hear him. I remember going into getting ready for a jazz band concert in the auditorium one day, and we were doing a sound check, and Lyle was in there, and with a couple of the other musicians from the one of the bands he was playing in, and they sat down and they started playing Cherokee at some ridiculous tempo and all 12 keys, and it was just like one of those those moments. So anyway, that's kind of how I really first got to know Lyle. And I'm going to start out by sharing just a little bit of music. This has actually come down originally from a reel-to-reel tape, then to a cassette that I had for years, and then eventually onto my computer. And anyway, it's actually amazing quality still. Here we go. So this was a rare public or a public quartet concert that happened at a club called the Mug. And anyway, this is an excerpt of a solo from a piece called Sombra. Some of you have heard it. It's on Elvin Jones and the Lighthouse album. And here's a little. So there you go. That was Lyle when he was about 19 years old, I believe, something like that. Would have been October of 74, I believe. So kind of one thing that happened down there was when Lyle came down middle of the year. Um, he had been on the road, I guess, kicking B3 and pedals with a Tower of Power funk band prior to that, and so his reading wasn't really up on the game, and so when the auditions happened for the lab bands, which they would happen typically every semester, um, Pat Coyle retained the 1 o'clock um, slot, and Lyle was in the 2 o'clock band for the first semester. So they became best of friends. They became roommates and lifelong friends. And of course, the next year, their two slots switched. Pat went to the 2, and Lyle went to the 1. And Pat was more than overjoyed and more than full of gratitude that this was what should happen, you know. And so what happened in that second year? Actually, the first year, Lyle wrote several pieces. Sir Gawain and the Night, and there were two other pieces. I'm going to try to get those from Pat sometime because I don't have recordings of those. But he wrote, I think, two or three pieces that made it on the Lab '74 album.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and then so anyway, the following year, Lyle started, pouring out all this music, writing all this music, and the typical thing was that the 1 o'clock band would do a vote in the early spring of all the music they had played through that year, and there were many people in the bands and throughout the school that were submitting pieces of music, and that then there would be a vote for what pieces would be on the album, and the pieces that had the most votes would all end up on the album. Well, when the votes came in, every piece was Lyle's. So he basically had this amazing album that was entirely his music, all original except for an arrangement of Chick Corea's "What Was," which was also his arrangement. So one of the things that I remember happening at that time, two things that stood out, was that two of my roommates were in the 1 o'clock band, Bill Kyle and Dick Kent, two of the saxophone players. And I remember Lyle calling up on the phone and saying, what does Dick play better clarinet or flute? And what about Bill? I'm trying to write these parts and I want to write how they play the best. And then about a week later, he called me up and he said that he had been writing all this music and he had all these pencil charts and wondered if the 1 o'clock band could come over to our living room on the Sunday and play through these charts. So the very first reading of all these charts, FM and Overture to the Royal Mongolia Suman Foosball Festival and Adventures of Supertonic, all of those were in our living room. We had a house that was bordered by a vacant lot and a car lot, so it was a perfect place. So that was the first reading of those pieces. And the other thing I do remember is that other people would tell me that he had spent, night after night in the white spot with till 3 or 4 in the morning with coffee and score paper, and all of that music he wrote completely without any piano or anything. It was just score paper and pencil. So that's kind of how all that music came down. So anyway, I'm going to do a foray into um, just a theme of one of the pieces on the whole last three pieces of it is actually it was a 5 movement. I'd love to hear the movements that never got recorded. Adventures of Supertonic, and the very first one and the very first theme. I was really listening to that, and then I realized that it was really common with this bass line that came into the piece San Lorenzo with Pat Metheny. So you're going to hear a little excerpt of this theme and how he developed the theme, and then a little excerpt of that bass line, and then a little excerpt out of the movement 5 Supertonic, which also you'll hear how he uses those kinds of things and develops the theme and plays the theme back at halftime and that kind of thing too. That's really some of that development stuff that he was doing all the way back then that you really hear in all of the Metheny music in years later. So here we go. We'll pull that one up. There's the famous Lab Band Lizard cover. So there's just a little taste of that music from that time. So if you've never had a chance to check out that music in depth, I highly encourage it. Towards the end of this session, too, I'll post. I put together a whole page of resources, including the link to that. You can find that on YouTube, and and all the cuts on the whole album and stuff. So I'll put that up later. People can, and I'll add to that resource list when I get into stuff for next week. A couple things I remember of that period of time with my roommates. I remember them being out till like really late at night sometimes. Working on this and all the stories they had about it. But the thing that I really remember of that music being so just totally, like ironed into my mind was is that as soon as the semester ended, they had just finished mixing it down, and it had not been released into a recording yet. And my roommates, my two roommates and I all moved down to Arlington for the summer because we all had jobs playing in the pit band at Six Flags. And I remember that one of my roommates had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and we listened to that entire thing, at least one time a night for the entire summer. I mean, like it was one of those things like we listened to it every day. And so, how that kind of thing really just is so indelible on your mind. When I haven't heard this stuff for years, and I can still, remember everything. A couple of things that I remember too is that right after that time was when Lyle headed out. He went on the road with Woody Herman. Later ended up playing with Marlena Shaw, Joni Mitchell, and some of that stuff, and then the Pat Metheny stuff. And I'm going to get more into some of that as we go, especially in the second session, but just kind of mention that was kind of the progression of things that happened after that. One of the things that I also wanted to kind of bring into tonight's digging deeper was I tried to dig into a few of his interview clips and also his ideas about compositional improvisation, which really started to take shape in the Metheny band, especially around the Wichita Falls music. And I believe I got to hear that live twice. The one time I definitely remember hearing it live was in Toronto on one of those circular stages that rotates. And I was up there with the band Kinesis, and we had played I think the day before, and then they were on. So we got to hear it in the rotating stage. So anyway, here's some excerpts and a little bit of Lyle's words. I thought you guys would probably enjoy this. I think most of this is from his last recorded phone interview that he did with the guy from Jazz Is magazine. Can't remember his name. Anyway, here we go.
There's a certain type of compositional improvisation that you are known for.
Well, I spent most of my time listening to classical music. I'm not really a very good jazz musician in the sense that I couldn't tell you who's played with whom and, give you chapter and verse of everyone's career because I didn't listen to jazz. I could maybe tell you more about various conductors, but I think the fact that I was so influenced by classical composers just made me want to put a level of structure into my improvisations. But I never thought that jazz and improvisation were inextricably linked. I always thought that jazz was a style and improvisation was a technique.
I did want to ask you something about an album you had just mentioned, and that was As Falls, Wichita Falls, an iconic record. Some people I know that know nothing about jazz say that that was their introduction to instrumental music. You've never done another one. How come?
I don't really know. We had talked about it. I mean, there's no big story here. There's no obstacle. It's just something that we never got around to.
For me, and I think for a lot of music lovers, took you out of the jazz keyboardist world and put you into something that was maybe a little more expansive. And the textures, and what were you thinking back then when you were creating an album like that that sort of was a springboard for so much other music that came out after that? They wanted to have that sound and that sort of that drama.
Well, I guess you would call it high concept or something, but Pat and I discussed how to make a record very different from the traditional jazz duo, where you just sat down and played on some tunes. And we thought, being kids, essentially, that we needed to put a little more into it. We couldn't just rely on our blowing chops, that we had to really sculpt something just to show that we were serious. Mm-hmm. So we really planned out the whole record, even though there were long passages that were improvised, but the setting and the approach for those sections were carefully rehearsed. I had an old 4-track tape recorder at the time, and Pat and I did test runs where we actually rehearsed doing overdubs in an improvised fashion. So the piece, As Falls Wichita, was never completely written out. It was never set in stone. We just had almost like a shooting script that we were trusting that on the day of filming, to continue the metaphor, we knew how to do it. We just didn't know what would actually come out. And we got lucky. We had never worked with Nana before. We didn't know how that would go, but he just loved it. Like playing with textures for him was just something he did naturally. So we hit it off right off the bat, and we just put together the piece in the studio.
So just a little, I think it's always nice to, catch some of those interview clips. Kind of moving forward during the Matheny years, my connections generally were, after a concert, meeting up for a few minutes, that kind of thing. There used to be a club in Boulder for the younger ones on tonight. If you've ever been to the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder, there was this most incredible club. It was called the Blue Note. We had a Blue Note in Boulder, and it was about the size of the old Dazzle, maybe, and it was just a wonderful place. I heard Keith Jarrett and Dexter Gordon there and many other people. But um, I got to hear them there, I think 2 times. And they were at Rainbow Music Hall, another place in Denver. I got to hear them there. And that was actually very memorable. It was not planned. After the concert, I was backstage talking to Lyle, and he asked if I had a car, and I said yes. Well, let's get in. There's Jimmy Smith is playing downtown at this hotel, and let's go. And pretty soon we were sitting 3 feet from Jimmy Smith, and soon Pat showed up, and it was just one of the things that like was not on the plan. And another momentous time that I do remember that really kind of was I look back now, was that just a matter of rhythm. It was not planned. I had gone up to take my youngest one, Corey, up to an improv camp that was happening in Toronto that summer, and got up there and found out the Montreal Jazz Festival was just finishing up. So I rented a car and got in my car and drove 300 miles and pulled into town and found out that the next day was going to be the final concert with the Pat Metheny group, and that it was, in fact, the Way Up tour, which I had heard one of the first concerts when it was in Denver, Paramount Theater, back the March before. They had actually finished the tour completely and had not planned to continue, and then they got the call to do the Montreal Jazz Festival. So I saw Lyle at the sound check, after the sound check, and he said, "This is going to be historic because this will be the last time we'll ever play that piece of music. It's not like we're going to go do a concert later and pull that piece of music out, 90-minute piece of music." And it was not only the last time they played it, but really, in essence, it was the last time Lyle played with the Metheny band. And there was a couple of quartet things that he did, just like maybe 2 or 3 days at the Blue Note in Tokyo, and some years later. But really, as far as the actual group and touring, that was really the end of it for him. One of the things that and that's kind of really where our really connection started to happen more after that. He was living out in LA, and we started to connect either by phone or by email. And the one thing that a lot of people kind of wonder, like whether there was some kind of big falling out with him and Pat Metheny, and and why did they not continue? And I was really fortunate. Well, 2 things happened. One is that I think around 2012, my son Trevor was giving his junior recital at Cal Arts, and I had messaged Lyle about it, and I was driving over to go to the concert and got a phone call from Lyle, and he said, "Tell me again where that's at. I want to come." And so he showed up for Trevor's junior recital, and we got to talk for a while. The following year, I was actually out for Trevor's senior recital, and he was not able to come, but we were able to meet for lunch over in Chatsworth, which is where he lived nearby. And that was really probably the most time I've ever really spent with him in terms of just connecting, conversation, finding out where what was going on, where he was headed, all that kind of thing. Certainly I'll have to say there's definitely people that were much closer to Lyle, and especially have played and remained close friends with him. But the times we were able to connect were just really amazing. And that encounter was really momentous, I think, because I really got to see, which later is confirmed in other things that I've read in interviews, that he just had it with the road. He really didn't like traveling. He did not like that part of it. And, the idea of, going to sleep in Prague and you're waking up in, South Africa or whatever, that was just, he just really, just did not like the traveling part. And, he basically said, I've been to all these places in the world and I've never seen any of them at all, and, in later years, I think he really would have loved to have traveled and seen places, but that whole thing, he couldn't do it. He really wanted to just kind of be on ground. That was really, really kind of what happened. So, the thing that I will bring up next is one of my favorite recordings that he did around 2010 or 11 with all of the techie guys from Caltech. He was really fond of coming back from tours and going and hanging out with all these physicists and scientists and things like that. That was one of his great loves, architecture and Legos and physicists and all that kind of thing, games and and pool. He became a tournament level pool player in Las Vegas for several years, and that was actually the time when I had lunch with him. That's what he was doing at that time, and anyway, it was really interesting because one of the things that he asked me a lot about teaching, because he hadn't done a lot of the teaching kind of thing, even like Pat has done. And he kind of said, I've just never really wanted to do that. He had gone and done one thing for Steve Houghton over at Indiana, where Steve got him to come and talk about composition for the Way Up. And but he really was kind of. But at the same time, I was really talking to him about mentoring and my experiences with mentoring. And so then, as we talked, he was like, "Well, I actually kind of do that because there's these kids, man, that I meet every week down at the pool table, and I'm mentoring them, or these kids that I meet for chess, and I teach chess too, So he had this other thing where he really was doing mentoring, and it really blew my mind because just a couple years later, we were on the phone and he was all excited because he was going to go down to North Texas State and be an artist in residence. Steve Wiest had got him to come down and do a thing, and he actually loved that whole thing while he was down there. I talked to him afterwards as well, and so I think in a way I felt like our conversation was sort of like loosened the thing a little bit, like, okay, yeah, maybe I can go do this, and really grow from it, and he really did. So anyway, this is the piece at the end of the Caltech video. If you've never seen it, go watch the whole thing sometime. The first part is all these improvisations. They're based on the physics formulas of Richard Feynman, and then they go into this Latin piece of his called Before You Go, which is really interesting. I just saw this on his website. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's Lyle's own words. I just watched Hannah and Her Sisters again and was struck by one particular cut from that remarkable soundtrack. It was You Are Too Beautiful by Richard Rodgers. Specifically, I think the harmonic motion at the beginning of that song must have influenced me when I wrote Before You Go. Check out the two tracks and tell if you can hear the influence. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but the harmonic thinking seems very similar to me today. So, there we go, and here we come. Enjoy this if you haven't heard it, and if you have, you'll enjoy it again, I am sure. So anyway, I actually have another cut or two that I was going to play, but I'm thinking, looking at time, I really want to do allow a little bit of time if there are questions and stuff. I'd like to allow a little bit of time for that, and I will mention too just a couple of things for if you're able to jump on next week. Bring a couple other people along. It's going to be great. I've got some really amazing stuff. One of the things I'm going to share next week is this series of emails that are just like mind blowing about his whole going to New York and getting the Pat Metheny band and the whole thing, and it was like a mind blowing set of emails. So I'm going to share those next week. The other thing I'll mention, a couple of things I'm going to hit on next week is probably the composition proof, a solo on proof, and also let's see, episode d'azur probably. Also, I'm going to touch on his niece, Aubrey Johnson, who just released this incredible album, amazing singer, and he used to talk to me all the time about her from the time she was in like junior high. So I'll be covering those kinds of things next week. Slink, probably Slink too. Anyway, that's kind of for next week. So I hope you'll jump on for that. Also, I will mention, and I'm going to put up those that link, a resource link, and that'll be included in there too. But a new web page just came up by Joseph Vela. He's the webmaster with Pat Metheny Group, and he and along with Aubrey put up this amazing memorial web page for Lyle that is probably the most mind-blowing web page I've ever found anywhere. I've been on it for hours and hours, and I've only scratched the surface. So bootlegs and videos and different stories from different people and Lyle's words and different kinds of things from building Legos to designing his sister's house and things like that. So it's really some cool stuff, and it's easy to find, lylemays.com. So I will encourage everybody to check that out when you get a chance. And so any questions, I would just say unmute yourself and shout it out if you have anything. So
Hey, Joe, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Scott.
Hey, who was the drummer on that last video?
I'll have to look it up exactly, but all of those guys are like professors at Caltech.
It was good.
They're all professors at Caltech. So they're all these guys he'd been hanging out with, with the physics stuff, and found out they played, and so they put this together for this TED conference thing, So
that's Tom Warrington on bass.
Is it? Oh yeah,
he's
right.
not a professor at Caltech, I guarantee you.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying, Eric. Anything else, man? Anybody's got any other observations?
Hi, Joe. It's Bill Lyons from Denver.
Hey, Bill. Great to see you.
Hey, Bill. Yeah, Holly and I are here tonight. Really enjoying the show. And my question for you, Joe, is can you relate more of the, that earlier time, with Lab 75? I'd just love to hear more about Lyle's earlier. It was great hearing about him in college and you being in Denton at the same time. It was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me it was really I would hear the stories because I would hear the stories about him. He was legendary for his the way he would get into something and then he wouldn't sleep until he mastered it. And one of those things at the time was foosball. And he became like nobody could beat him in foosball during those years, and so that was a legendary thing. I kind of crossed paths with people that were playing with him from time to time, but then I got to know Pat Coyle, and I was actually in a band with Pat Coyle during that second year there in the year of Lab 75, this school year, and Pat was his roommate, so I would see him from time to time when I go over to Pat's house. And we cross paths at different things and, parties and improv classes and things like that. But honestly, I didn't really know that much about his writing until, I was hearing that he was writing all this stuff and they were playing it in the 1 o'clock band, but I hadn't even heard the music until they came to my living room that day and started playing it. So, and then from there, of course I heard it all the time because my roommates would have in the beginning it was the rough mixes, and then later they had the final mix on a reel-to-reel tape that we listened to all summer. So the one other story I do remember the time when the Wichita Jazz Festival was happening. I think it was in that spring, and I did remember hearing about the quartet, which was him and I believe Steve Houghton and Kirby Stewart and Pete Brewer going down to play at the festival. And it was at that festival that he met Pat Metheny for the first time. He had talked to Pat before on the phone. He had been hooked up through like Dominic Spira, I believe, and Rich Madison. Some people had hooked him up with Pat, and so they had talked on the phone before. But that was the first time they actually met, and they went into a dressing room and said, "Let's write a tune together." And that's when they wrote the piece called "It's for You," which is the iconic piece with that synthy, Oberheim synthy patch, that you hear. So that I do remember that, hearing about that, and then honestly, for me, after school, because I spent the summer down there playing in this pit band, and then I moved up to Denver, and then about a year or so after that, I was in this band with Rob Mullins called Solaris, and we went down to play the Telluride Jazz Festival, and Metheny was down there, and that was actually the very first the White Album band. They were traveling all over the country, like 300 miles plus a day, all four of them in the van with their equipment. And I think that was really one of the first gigs they had actually done too, was the Telluride gig that summer. And I do remember we had played maybe two bands before them, and then I got to hear them, and of course that was the first time I really got to hear that music, live, which was with the auto harp and all that kind of stuff. And but I remember getting together with Lyle afterwards in his hotel room, and it was a condo actually, I think, and he pulls out these big architectural plans of this futuristic house that he was designing. And so those were the kinds of things that he would, he loved architecture and he loved building. And then I remember at one period at a time when we were emailing or talking on the phone, he had been flying up to Seattle because he had just built a whole new thing for Legoland up in Seattle. And he supposedly, other people I know said that he had this huge room in his house that was just this monster Lego thing that he built. So those are kind of some of the stories that I heard from other people. And then later, like I said, in the later years, our friendship really became more of this email thing back and forth. I was actually pulled out this one email that was when we were talking about. I think we were going back and forth about talking about creativity and human potential and stuff like that. And here was his response. A lot is made of thinking outside the box, a phrase now so overused that its utterers are clearly inside another box. I advocate imagining within the manual. A deep reflection of the information contained in even the most modest manual might suggest uses the designers never imagined. But, of course, this requires actually reading and understanding said manual. I have no future on the lecture circuit. My methods require the hard work of a technician, the hard work of a poet, and an ability to know which skill is needed when. Who wants to hear that solutions require work, right? Yes, if we embrace where we are first, then look deeper into how we got there, why we are there, etc., we are less likely to fall into the trap of complaining or other useless endeavors. I am fond of starting my talks on composition with the idea that creativity is overrated. I then go on to make the case that creativity is an organic byproduct of deep immersion and rigorously applied study. We humans can't help but want to create if we are paying attention at all. But how to get people to pay attention at even the most basic level when they're not aware that they are not paying attention? I am always asking myself, did they even hear some previous sentence? And if they heard it, did it penetrate? And if it penetrated, did it change anything? But then, those occasional reports come back about how I shook things up or opened doors, and I am ready for the next round. I think teachers should be paid like lawyers, and lawyers like teachers, but I'm clearly not in charge. Doesn't change my opinion, though. I have a few private students I teach for free because they're worth it, and I get so much in return. They are the opposite of the ignorant, channel-flipping couch potato. Every generation has them, and they are inspiring. Hell, you may have created some yourself. So anyway, you know, his writing thing is just so amazing too. And as you will hear, the ones that I'm going to share on the thing next week are just mind blowing. And I actually have been in touch by email with Joseph Vella, the one that's done this website, and just to let him know that I have some things that you know, he might be interested in having on there. And he did email back and said, yes, we'll be in touch, and left me his phone number. So I haven't actually talked to him yet, but I'm hoping to get some stuff up there of some of this, you know, along the way. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to put on one more cut, and this is just to hear amazing solo, and this is with Matheny, and this is from the piece called Straight on Red. So, hope you guys all had a really great time on this little hang tonight. Thanks, everybody.